Stepfather threw his autistic stepdaughter into the well, but the stray dog witnessed his secret. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always awesome to see how far our stories are reaching. Emily didn't speak, not because she couldn't, but because the world was too loud, chaotic, and unpredictable for her. She was diagnosed with autism at 3, and since then, her life had been a quiet struggle. Emily lived with her mom, Claire, a 35-year-old woman who worked long hours as a seamstress in a clothing factory. Claire was the kind of person who always tried to see the bright side, even though she was breaking inside. Her life hadn't been easy. A lonely youth becoming a mom too young and an ex-husband who vanished when he learned of Emily's diagnosis. Now she did everything she could to keep their home running, even at the cost of her health and time at home. Their house was simple, clean, but a little sad. The living room had an old blue velvet couch, a bookshelf with unread books, and black and white photos of a family that no longer existed. On the walls, Emily's drawings hung in no particular order, silent witnesses to her inner world. Fields full of flowers, dogs with big ears, faceless figures. That was her way of talking, of saying what she couldn't put into words. Every morning, Claire left early, her hair tied back, wearing a wrinkled uniform, leaving Emily with a babysitter who barely understood her. But that was about to change. Claire, desperate not to raise her daughter alone, had met a man named Richard, a mechanic with a rough voice and hands always stained with grease. At first, Richard seemed kind and helpful. He brought flowers, fixed things around the house, and crouched down to look at Emily with a fake smile. Claire, craving love and companionship, didn't want to see beyond that. But Emily saw it. She didn't need words to notice that his smile wasn't real. One fall afternoon, as dry leaves covered the sidewalks like a sad carpet, Claire shared the news with excitement. "We're getting married," she said, holding Emily's small hand in hers. "Richard is going to live with us." Emily didn't answer. Her gaze drifted to the drawing in front of her, a stray dog sitting in front of a house with no windows. The girl knew, with that quiet wisdom some have who live in silence, that her world was about to change, and not for the better. The wedding was simple, without a church or a white dress, just a quick ceremony at the courthouse and a meal at a diner with paper tablecloths and plastic utensils. Claire, in a plain beige dress she sewed herself, smiled with tired eyes. Richard, in a wrinkled shirt and a poorly tied tie, looked more uncomfortable than happy. Still, Claire insisted it was the start of a new life. "Everything's going to be better now, Emily," she said that night, stroking her daughter's hair as she sat quietly by the window. On the other side of the glass, the moon seemed to watch them with a quiet sadness. Emily didn't respond. She never did in moments like these, but inside, something tightened, a bad feeling. Richard moved in the next day. He brought tools, an old TV, and a smell of sweat mixed with motor oil that filled every corner of the house. It didn't take long for him to take control. He moved furniture, criticized the food, complained the TV was too quiet. Claire, used to giving in, barely stood up for herself. She only asked for patience with a look, hoping things would get better with time. But Richard didn't understand Emily. He looked at her with cold eyes, as if she were a piece of furniture in the way or a burden he didn't deserve. The first few days he pretended to be kind, but his discomfort was clear. Emily didn't look him in the eye, didn't answer when he spoke, didn't smile or laugh, and that bothered him more than he admitted. "What's wrong with this kid?" he asked Claire one night during dinner in the living room, while Emily drew quietly on the floor. "She's different. She just needs time," Claire replied softly. "No, Claire, this isn't normal. Do you know how hard it is to live with a kid who doesn't even see you? It feels like there's a ghost in the house." The words hit like punches. Emily didn't look up, but her hand shook slightly on the paper. Claire lowered her gaze, swallowing hard, too tired to argue. That night, Emily dreamed of wolves. Wolves with glowing eyes that circled her bed without a sound, waiting for the moment to strike. In the days that followed, the house felt colder even though it was fall. Richard's footsteps made the floor creak, as if something dark was creeping through the hallways. Claire grew more distant, caught between work and her useless attempts to please a husband who looked at her not with love but with annoyance. Emily withdrew further, finding refuge in her drawings and the soft sounds she made, like invented songs only she understood. But no one listened, not even her mum. The wedding wasn't the start of a fairy tale, but the beginning of a dark chapter. And though the house still stood, something inside it was starting to crumble. The first signs were almost invisible, like shadows that go unnoticed. A door slamming hard, plate disappearing without explanation, a sharp word in the middle of silence. But for Emily, everything was noise. Everything was impact. Claire left the house at 6 in the morning. Emily was left alone with Richard until afternoon. The babysitters, unable to handle the girl's behavior, stopped coming one by one, and Claire, drowning in debt, chose not to ask too many questions. "They're just a few hours," she told herself as she put on her scarf at the bus stop. "Richard will take care of her." But Richard didn't care. Richard watched. Emily didn't like sudden changes, loud noises, or hard stares, and Richard was all of those things. When Claire walked out the door each morning, Emily's voice shut down. She stopped trying to speak. She stopped humming. She moved slowly through the corners, avoiding places where he might see her. "Enough with that damn humming," he shouted one morning when Emily, sitting by the window, repeated a soft melody with her mouth closed, barely a whisper. "Why do you do that? Are you trying to drive me crazy?" He stormed toward her. Emily shrank back. He didn't hit her. Not yet. But he ripped her sketchbook from her hands and threw it to the floor with force. "Do something normal. Talk, answer, look at me for once." She didn't cry. She just turned her face to the window. Outside, a bare tree stood against the wind. So did she. That was the first push. Not a hit, but a shove. Hard. Dirty. Enough to make her lose her balance and fall onto the rug. Richard didn't help her up. He just huffed and locked himself in his room, as if the girl was a minor annoyance. Day after day, the routine became a minefield. If Emily didn't eat enough, Richard left her without dinner. If she left a toy in the hallway, he threw it in the trash. If she hummed, he yelled. If she moved too much, he pushed her into a corner. And Claire didn't know. At night, when she came home exhausted, she found Emily quieter, stiller. She thought it was part of the process, part of adjusting. Richard, skilled at lying, smiled and said, "She was calm today, barely moved. Seems like she's starting to get how things work." And Claire, so broken inside, nodded. She thought the silence was progress. She didn't see it was actually surrender. In Emily's room, where drawings once covered the walls, now there were only blank pages. The pencil lay on the floor. The silence was heavy, and behind that silence, an 8-year-old girl was falling apart in ways no one could see. It was a November afternoon, cloudy with a damp wind, when Emily saw him for the first time. She was sitting on the back porch, legs crossed still. Her grey eyes looked past the yard, through the bare branches swaying like tired arms. Then, from the bushes, a thin, mud-covered figure appeared. A dog. He was a medium-sized mutt with big ears and dirty cream-colored fur. His ribs showed and he limped on one back leg, but his eyes, a clear blue and almost human, held something Emily didn't see anywhere else. Attention, not fear, not disdain, just attention. The dog stopped when he saw her, a few feet away. Emily didn't move either. For a long time they just looked at each other, as if they already knew one another. Then the dog took a step forward, but didn't bark or whine. He just lay down under the bare tree and rested his head on his paws, silent. That was the first visit. He came back the next day. This time, Emily was waiting. She had hidden a piece of stale bread in her jacket pocket, bread Richard had tossed aside the night before. She pulled it out slowly and left it on the edge of the porch. The dog, with careful steps, came closer, sniffed and ate quietly. Then he sat down. There were no pets, no words, just presence. And that presence became a routine. While Claire worked and Richard vented his anger with shouts and shoves, the dog, whom Emily secretly named Shadow, showed up. Always at the same time, always quiet. Sometimes he waited outside the fence. Sometimes he came closer. He never crossed into the house, as if he knew it wasn't safe. For the first time in weeks, Emily started moving her hands to draw. Sketches of a dog with big blue eyes filled her notebook. In one, she drew herself and Shadow sitting by a well, surrounded by flowers. Shadow became her only refuge. One day when Richard came home earlier than usual, he saw her with the dog. He slammed the door open. "What are you doing with that filthy mutt?" he yelled. Emily stood up at once. The bread she held fell to the ground. The dog, seeing the man, stepped back but didn't run. Richard grabbed a broom from the corner and raised it in the air. Emily, by instinct, stepped in front of the dog, arms spread wide. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just stood there. Richard lowered the broom, not out of kindness, but because something in him burned with cold rage. "This is over," he muttered through clenched teeth. Then he turned, went inside, and slammed the door so hard the windows shook. Shadow disappeared before dusk that day, but Emily knew he'd be back. She felt it. She knew it with a certainty that didn't need words. Winter was creeping in, with cold, cloudy gusts against the windows. The leafless branches looked like claws reaching for the grey sky. The house, always quiet, had grown even more lifeless. Claire spent longer hours at the factory due to year-end demand. Because of this, Emily was left completely alone with Richard, who no longer hid his irritation. The routine with Shadow continued, but it was riskier every day. Emily had to make sure Richard wasn't around, hiding scraps under her jacket and waiting for the exact moment to slip out the back door. Each day was a small act of resistance, a challenge to a world that denied her a voice. One night, after Claire fell asleep on the couch with her shoes still on, Richard got up carefully and went to Emily's room. He didn't turn on the light. He walked to the window, pulled the curtain slightly, and looked out to the backyard. Shadow was there, waiting, as always. Richard clenched his teeth and muttered, "Tomorrow this circus ends." He went back to his room but didn't sleep. He spent hours in the dark, staring at the ceiling, with a cruel, final idea in his head. The next day the sky dawned clear, as if the world ignored what was coming. Claire, exhausted, agreed without hesitation when Richard offered to take Emily to see the wildflowers in the country. "She hasn't left the house in days. Some fresh air will do her good," he said, putting a thick jacket on Emily. Claire, trusting someone she shouldn't have, kissed her daughter's forehead and went back to her sewing without looking up. The car ride was silent. Emily, hands on her lap, watched the scenery pass with empty eyes. Richard didn't speak. He gripped the steering wheel, driving down rural roads that grew narrower and lonelier. Finally, he stopped at a clearing on the edge of an abandoned field. He got out and opened Emily's door. "Come on, I want to show you something nice." Emily obeyed without a sound. They walked a few minutes until they reached an old dry well surrounded by grass and rocks. The air was heavy, the silence thick. Richard stopped at the edge of the well. He turned slowly. His face no longer pretended. "Do you know what you are, Emily?" he muttered. "A problem. A weight that drags everyone down. Your mom doesn't say it, but she thinks it. And I can't take it anymore." Emily didn't understand the words, but she felt the tone. She felt the coldness in his stare. She took a step back, but it wasn't enough. Richard pushed her. The girl's body fell silently, wrapped in her jacket. There was no scream. No struggle, just a dull thud against the bottom. He stood there, breathing hard. He looked down. He saw no movement. He heard no crying. He turned and walked back to the car. In his mind, there was no guilt, only relief. The silence inside the well was total, thick as the damp earth surrounding every inch of the place. Emily lay at the bottom, her jacket dirty and torn, her body bent at an odd angle. She had fallen on her side, hitting her shoulder and hip against the hard stone. A thin line of blood ran from her forehead to the neck of her sweater. Her eyes were open, but they didn't focus on anything. The fall hadn't knocked her out completely, but her mind had retreated, like a turtle hiding from danger. She was trapped between physical pain and a deep mental block, that invisible place she escaped to when the world was too cruel. A faint wisp of breath came from her mouth. Each breath was weak, shaky. She could barely move. She lifted her right hand a few inches before pain forced her to stop. She made soft, guttural whimpers, almost inaudible, like the sounds she made as a toddler when something scared her. No one heard them now. The daylight barely reached the bottom. Only a faint glow came through the well's opening, fading as clouds covered the sky. Emily felt the cold creeping up her legs, her fingers growing numb. But the worst wasn't the physical pain. It was the abandonment. She didn't fully understand what had happened. Her mind, always shielded by layers of sensitivity, couldn't grasp the concept of murder. But she knew something was wrong. Very wrong. Hours passed. The day slowly turned to dusk. No one came. The sounds outside were distant, branches swaying in the wind, a lone crow, the rustle of earth settling in the damp. At the bottom of the well, Emily started losing track of time. She closed her eyes at times, not to sleep, but to escape. In one of those moments, her mind painted a picture, a field of purple flowers, a dog running toward her, and a warm sun that didn't burn but caressed. When she opened her eyes again, it was dark, a heavy, shapeless darkness. Only her breathing, only the silence. But then suddenly something changed. A faint crunch, a different echo, as if something moved above. Emily tried to turn her face. She saw nothing, but something inside her sparked. An instinct, a feeling. Someone was looking for her, or something. And for the first time that endless day, her hand lifted a little higher. She didn't call for help, she didn't scream, but she breathed a little stronger, and she held on. Night fell over the field like a heavy, damp blanket. The wind whistled through the bare branches, dragging dead leaves that seemed to whisper secrets to the ground. The stars hid behind a cloudy sky, no moon in sight. In the middle of that vast darkness, miles from any house, a furry figure moved through the grass with uneven but determined steps. It was Shadow. The dog had sensed something was wrong since early that day. That morning, Emily didn't come out. She didn't peek through the window. She didn't leave crumbs on the porch. There was no drawing, just emptiness. And Shadow wasn't an ordinary dog. He had known abandonment. He knew the smell of sadness, loss, danger. For hours he waited by the fence, ears alert, eyes fixed on the back door. No one came. Then, without hesitation, he lifted his head and sniffed the air. Something in the wind spoke to him. A trail, a faint, fragile clue, almost impossible to follow, but enough for him. He started running. He crossed open fields, past rural paths, and dodged cars with instinctive precision. His body was weak, his legs tired, but his heart pushed each step like a war drum. He didn't stop. He didn't waver, because something inside him knew Emily needed him. Hours passed. The scent grew clearer, old mixed with dirt, oil, and something else, a soft, familiar smell. Shadow recognized it, Emily's jacket. Her presence lingered in the air like an invisible echo. When he reached the edge of the woods, he stopped. He looked around, panting. Before him was an abandoned clearing, and in the center, an old well surrounded by tall grass. He approached carefully. He sniffed the edge. A low bark came from his chest. She was there, the girl was down there. Shadow circled the well, scratching the dirt, barking loudly. He stopped, then barked again. There was no one to hear him. The darkness was total, but he didn't give up. He circled once more and then, without thinking, jumped. The fall was clumsy, unplanned. He landed beside Emily, hitting a leg against the wall. He yelped in pain. But the next moment, he was by her side, licking her face urgently. Emily opened her eyes. The world was still dark. It still hurt, but now she wasn't alone. The licks were warm. The dog's body, warm and real, pressed against hers like a shield. Emily didn't speak. She couldn't. But her trembling hand moved to Shadow's neck. She touched him. She held on. And there they stayed. Two broken souls sharing the bottom of a well, bound by an invisible tie no human could understand. He wasn't a trained hero. He had no owner, no story, no collar. But he had the one thing that mattered, the loyalty of a heart that would never abandon her. Dawn broke over the woods without mercy. A fog covered the paths, and the cold gripped like invisible claws. The well, sunken among the grass, stayed hidden from human eyes, as if the earth itself wanted to conceal the crime. Inside, Emily breathed with difficulty. Her body shook, not just from the cold, but from extreme exhaustion. Shadow, hurt and dirty, stayed pressed against her, covering her with his wet fur, gently licking her pale cheeks whenever her eyes started to close. But fate, that old trickster, wasn't done with its story. A few miles away, an older man walked with a flashlight in hand. It was Walter, 70 years old, his face lined by time, his eyes clear as a winter sky. He had come to the woods to gather dry branches and roots for his teas, a habit he'd kept since becoming a widower. As he walked, he heard something, a bark. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks, but the sound came again. Short, urgent, like a plea. Walter stopped. He listened harder. The bark returned, softer now, as if coming from under the ground. He frowned, turned his head and pushed through the bushes with his cane until he reached a clearing. There was the well. He approached carefully, shining his flashlight inside. "Hello?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Then a new sound came from the bottom, a faint whimper, followed by a weak but insistent bark. Walter dropped to his knees by the well, his heart racing. He aimed the flashlight with trembling hands. The light found two figures at the bottom, A still girl and a hunched dog looking up as if he'd been waiting for this moment forever. "My God," Walter whispered. "Is anyone out there? Help!" He pulled his phone from his pocket with clumsy fingers and called 911. He stumbled over his words, explaining the location as best he could. His voice was a mix of urgency and disbelief. Minutes later, red and blue lights broke the darkness. Sirens shattered the silence. Firefighters, paramedics, police. The whole woods woke up. The rescue was quick but careful. They lowered a rescuer with a thermal blanket first. Everyone was stunned to see the dog curled around the girl, unmoving, protecting her even from the arms coming to save her. "This dog, he didn't leave her side for a second," one rescuer said, his voice breaking. They pulled Emily out first, wrapped in blankets, her face pale and lips blue. Her pulse was weak, but she was alive. Then they brought up Shadow, who resisted leaving her, growling softly out of instinct. He only calmed when he saw she was safe. Claire arrived minutes later, alerted by the police. When she saw her daughter on the stretcher, she screamed with all her strength, "Emily, my love, no, no!" She fell to her knees, shaking, as the paramedics worked. No one fully understood how she'd ended up there. No one, except Emily and Shadow. That night, under a now clear sky full of stars, a miracle took shape in the middle of tragedy. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee. The white hallway lights offered no comfort, just a cold clarity. Claire sat in a waiting room chair, hands trembling in her lap, eyes red from crying. Across from her, a young doctor with a calm face explained Emily's condition in a steady voice. "She has a bad bruise on her side and a slight fracture in her collarbone. She's dehydrated and a bit hypothermic, but she'll survive." Claire nodded without speaking. She had no voice, just a burning knot in her throat. Emily was in the children's unit with Shadow lying by her stretcher. The doctors, seeing how the girl reacted when they tried to separate the dog, decided to let him stay. There was something special in that bond, something they couldn't and shouldn't break. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Police officers in uniform visited the hospital. One of them, Detective James Carter, with blue eyes and a firm jaw, spoke to Claire in a professional but serious tone. "Ma'am, we have reason to believe your husband is directly involved in what happened." The girl was pushed. "There's no doubt." Claire broke down, tears, guilt, confusion. I didn't see it coming. I thought he was trying to help me. I wanted Emily to have a dad. I never imagined." "We understand, but we need your help." Meanwhile, a forensic team examined the marks on Emily's body, gathering evidence. They also checked local emergency records. An anonymous report from 2 months ago about shouting in a house, never investigated. The key, though, didn't come from papers or statements. It came from Emily. On the third night in the hospital, a therapist named Sarah Thompson was assigned to her case. She had experience with nonverbal children and a natural kindness that wasn't forced. She sat by Emily with a notebook and markers. No pressure, just watching. Emily didn't speak, but she drew. A well, a car, a man with his back turned, a dog with blue eyes, and her, fallen at the bottom. Then she wrote one word, in big, shaky letters. Rick. That's what Claire called him at home. Only her. Sarah showed the drawing to the detective. They didn't need more. That same night, police arrived at the house. Richard was arrested without a fight. His eyes were empty, as if the world no longer belonged to him. "I just wanted peace," he said as they cuffed him. "And she just wanted to live," the officer replied. The trial was quick. The physical evidence, Claire's accounts, Emily's drawing, it all formed a cruel, complete puzzle. Local news called it the miracle of the well, highlighting the dog's bravery and the girl's quiet strength. Emily, still recovering, started making new sounds. Not full words, but they had rhythm, intent, emotion. When she heard Claire's voice, she sometimes reached out. When Shadow came near, she smiled. For the first time, she smiled. Claire made a decision. "I want to adopt this dog officially," she told the social worker. "He's not just a pet, he's family." And no one argued. Snow began to fall over the town like a quiet blessing. It was December, and the cold air swept through the bare branches, but this time it didn't hurt. Winter was no longer a threat, but a promise of shelter, rebuilding, something pure. Claire held Emily's hand as they walked down a stone path to their new home, a simple cabin on the outskirts, surrounded by pines and silence. They didn't need more. After all they'd been through, all that mattered was peace. and being together. Shadow ran through the frosty yard, wagging his tail like every step was a celebration. He wore a red collar with a tag that read, Miller Family. Claire had decided, after long talks with social workers and therapists, to take back her maiden name. Tell me in the comments, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate this story so far? Your opinion means a lot to me. She and Emily were starting fresh, free from the past. The house still smelled of new wood and fresh paint. Inside, Emily's drawings decorated the walls again. They weren't sad or dark anymore. Now there were fields with flowers, dogs jumping among clouds, and in the center of it all, a girl with big eyes and arms open to the sky. Claire set up a small sewing workshop in a corner of the living room where she worked on custom orders, watching Emily play with Shadow through the window. Sometimes Emily made soft sounds, almost like words, and every now and then a word came out clear. Shadow, she murmured one afternoon, petting the dog's head. Claire's heart leapt. She ran over, knelt by her daughter, and, without a word, hugged her. Emily didn't pull away. For the first time in a long time, she let herself be hugged. Her arms slowly wrapped around her mum's waist, like someone learning to trust again. The therapist said Emily was blossoming. Each day brought a small step forward. She responded to some gestures with steady looks. She started recognizing simple emotions, hunger, cold, joy, and above all, she showed affection. One morning, Claire opened the front door and found an envelope. Inside was a newspaper clipping, a story about Emily's rescue, with a photo of her and Shadow leaving the hospital, and a handwritten note. Thanks for showing miracles exist, Walter. It was the old man from the woods, who never appeared again, like an angel who completes his mission and drifts away with the wind. On the heaviest snow days, Emily and Shadow slept together on a rug in the living room by the fireplace, like two beings born from the same heart. Claire watched them sewing quietly with a soft smile and tears in her eyes. What was once a house of shouts was now a home of gentle murmurs. What was once pain was now a healed memory. And what seemed like an end turned out to be the truest beginning 5 years later. The fields around the lake were full of flowers. Daisies grew wild among the tall grass, and the air smelled of warm earth, of new things. It was a spring afternoon. The sky was clear, and the sun low on the horizon painted everything gold, like a promise kept. Emily, now 13, walked down a dirt path with a steady step. Her blonde hair moved with the breeze, and in her hands she carried a worn notebook and a red leash. On the other end of the leash, trotting with dignity, was Shadow, now older, with a white muzzle and slower steps, but with the same blue eyes full of life. They lived far from the past. Claire had rebuilt her life with strength and love. She opened a small handmade sewing shop in town, known not just for her skill, but for her story. But more important than any success was the peace that finally lived in their home. A peace woven with drawings, understood silences, and afternoons playing with Shadow. Emily now spoke, in a slow, sweet voice. She didn't use many words, but the ones she chose were precise, honest, deep. She learned to say what she felt without fear, and she learned to listen. "Mom," she said one night while they sorted books on the shelf, "I don't feel invisible anymore." Claire smiled without tears, without drama, just with that full look that comes when the heart is no longer broken. Richard was serving his sentence in a state prison. He was found guilty of attempted murder, child abuse, and abandonment. He didn't appeal. He didn't ask for forgiveness, but that no longer had a place in their lives. The past wasn't denied, but it no longer ruled. Walter, the old man who heard the saving bark, passed away last winter. Claire and Emily went to his funeral. They brought white flowers and a handkerchief embroidered by Emily with one word, "Thanks." They left it at his grave in silence. That gesture tied the last loose knot. One afternoon by the lake, Emily opened her notebook and showed Claire one of her new drawings. It was a house surrounded by trees, with a girl in the yard, a dog by her side, and a sky painted with bold blue strokes. "Is that us?" Claire asked, stroking her daughter's hair. "Yes," Emily replied with a soft smile, but this time, happy. Shadow lay beside them, letting out a deep sigh, as if he knew he no longer had to protect anyone, only enjoy. The breeze blew through the leaves. The flowers swayed. The past, at last, was left behind. And what was once born of pain now bloomed as a new beginning, one no one could ever take away. Thank you so much for sticking with this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a ton and motivates us to keep bringing new stories every week. And since you're here, take a moment to check out another one of our stories that's popping up on your screen. Big hug and see you next time. Stay well.